Well, good morning. By the time I finish this, it won't be morning, but I'm recording it in the morning. What a night. It was one of those rare nights where I actually felt sleepy at a normal bedtime. And then I got messages that woke me up. And boy, did they wake me up. Well, the first messages said that the subpoena had been found. But as it turns out, the subpoena itself has not been shown anywhere. But it does very much look like the case in which a subpoena, if one was issued, where it would have come from. And it's just as sneaky and underhanded and dirty as we expected it to be if a case was going to be found. I'm pretty cautious about things that I hear, so I needed to see the actual documents for myself. And so I have a copy of the summons and the complaint, and a few other little side things I looked up just to be sure that what I was saying was accurate, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. Once I laid eyes on these, poof, that was it. So, a lot of attorneys speak on these things. None of them are wrong. It's about different specialties, and you see it from a different way. And I actually like that. I like to hear all the different perspectives. And laws are different in each state. I was listening to Ask Two Lawyers last night, and they had a former judge from Florida on there. And just listening to the different perspectives between Florida law and California law was pretty shocking. So depending on the state, you have a different outlook. And then, of course, you have criminal versus civil. And in this case, that's really important because it really, really matters. So what we have is a Doe complaint. Like Jane Doe, John Doe. Everything about this case was meant to conceal it. There's no way around that. Ezra, with her sharp tongue, can say a million things, but everything about this lawsuit is meant to be concealed. So I saw that this morning Brian Friedman spoke about this. He said he knew nothing about it until he was asked by the Daily Mail to give his response. So imagine waking up to that. And I can't wait to see what he does with this because he has a lot of options here. Now, Team Blake's response was, people do Doe lawsuits all the time when they need to find something out. And there's nothing wrong with what we did, blah, blah, blah. But Mr. Friedman's right. This is abusive process, plain and simple. Because yes, you can file a Doe lawsuit when you don't know who the bad guys are and you need to figure that out. But there's a couple things wrong with saying that that's what this is. Why? Why was it filed under Vanzan? This tiny little company, and it looks like there's two of them, and this is one of the reasons I didn't want to speak about it too early, because more investigation needed to be done. So there's this Vanzan that was opened in New York, and this is weird. There's so many rabbit holes to take this down. This business was made in 2010. And the weird thing is, Ryan Reynolds was married to Scarlett Johansson in 2010. It's also the year that he and Blake filmed Green Lantern. And you'll notice that it's very close to his Instagram handle, Van City, and it looks like it might be defunct. I stopped that particular rabbit hole because it really has nothing to do with this. It's also interesting how quickly this business was made if they had just met in 2010. So either this relationship progressed really super fast, all the while that he was married, or maybe they knew each other before, and that's somehow how she ended up on this movie. I don't want to speculate too far on that one. I'm just saying I'm not putting anything past these two ever again. But so we have this company name that no one had ever heard of, very tiny, hasn't really done anything, it just sort of exists. This one was filed in New York. Years later, that is still active. So that's a whole big question if sleuths want to go down that rabbit hole when there's more time, but to me, that part of it is not important at this moment. Eventually, it would be very interesting to hear. But for this moment, there is a valid Vanzan Incorporated, and it was used in this suit. So here's the first thing that Team Blake is going to have to explain. You can file a Doe lawsuit when you need information, but why wasn't it filed in your name? Everything else was filed in your name. The CRD complaint, the lawsuit against Jed Wallace. If you were trying to do a legit lawsuit, your name would be there, not this weird business that nobody's ever heard of. So that's the first problem. Also, once you file this Doe complaint, you find out who the defendants are. They've put Does 1 to 10 inclusive because they expected to find multiple defendants or third parties to add to it. That's all okay. But then you don't close it out and make a whole new one. You expand on it. You add the defendants' names to it. It's still the same lawsuit, or it's supposed to be. So Doe lawsuits that get closed out, they get closed out not because you dump it, open a whole new one in a different name. They get closed out because they're not going to be followed up on. This was followed up on. So it is very obvious that this was a sham lawsuit. Only put out there for the purposes, as they're saying, but we're going to talk about that, to get information. Now, this was filed on September 27th. And this date's important because the Daily Mail has said that they laid eyes on a subpoena that was dated on October 1st. But they did say they have seen it and it does not have a court stamp. So that made everything suspicious. But there's more. How did they go through things quickly enough to get a subpoena put out by the court? I mean, this document was just filed. Nothing else was ever filed. These does were never listed. And if we look at the dates of when this was closed, it was closed December 19th. Does that ring a bell? Of course it does. The CRD complaint was filed on December 20, the very next day. And the New York Times article the very next day after that, the 21st. We also know from the metadata that Blake was working with the New York Times on this story as early as October. Their article came out on the 21st. They'd obviously worked on it for some duration of time. They speak about reviewing thousands of pages of texts and emails, which we know takes a long time. We know that an article of this size goes through meetings, goes through the legal department, goes through the editors, and just getting through thousands of pages of documents is going to take a long time. What was in those thousands of pages of texts and emails? Names. Jennifer Abel, Melissa Nathan, Justin Baldoni, Jamie Heath, producers, editors. We've only seen the messages that are on the legal documents. We don't know what the rest of them say. So if this information was supplied to the New York Times back in October, days after this was filed, why were no defendants' names at any point ever added? You knew the names. They weren't Doe's anymore. Why were they not added to this lawsuit? How are they going to explain that? That shows that they were not intending to go on with this lawsuit. Because if they were, this complaint would have been amended to add those names. These people would have been served. There would have been responses filed by them. Eventually discovery started. None of that. None of that happened long after these people weren't Doe's anymore. And were they ever Doe's? This is the other question. And it just really shows that they did not think this stuff through. I don't know if it's arrogance, hubris, or if they really thought this lawsuit was never going to go this far. Are they so used to being able to, for example, pay $2 million to the NAACP after having a plantation wedding and blackface and becoming an influential person of the year? I mean, are they so used to things like that happening in their life that they thought that it could happen this way in a court of law? That they thought they were slick, that they thought they were powerful, that they thought they could make people yield to them? Or is it ignorance? And by saying ignorance, I'm not calling anybody stupid. I'm saying ignorant in its true meaning, like they don't know better. But whatever drove them to think that they could do this, and whatever made the lawyers think that this would be okay, you're just shaking your head through this whole thing. Because it's, in this day and age, you're leaving tracks with everything that you do. This was an obvious attempt to hide this. Obvious. But bringing all these thousands of pages in has been problematic to themselves, really, in the long run, because we have a threat made by Leslie Sloan, Blake's PR person, back in August, that she has these messages and she's coming after him. If that statement was made in August, that's where the trouble begins. If you have those messages, if you know who to threaten, if you already have the names, how are you going to explain this Doe lawsuit claiming that you did it so you could find out who the bad guys were? You already knew. You'd already seen it. So it seems that this is worse than it looks. It looks like this was done after the fact to explain the reason why they had what they had. Because if they had it already in August, if they'd seen it, if they knew, they filed this is just a cover to say, oh, this is where we got the information. And try to just leave out the fact that they already had it the month before. It's not going to work. Because one thing about Team Blake, they just walk around telling on themselves all the time. The amount of stuff that people have dug up of the things that they have said openly, on camera, giving themselves away every step of the way. Here's just another one. I mean, this compulsion they have to keep running their mouths has really been their own undoing. And this is yet another case of that. But the big question is, now what? Now, I've heard people who deal more in criminal law talking about fruit of the poisonous tree and throwing out the case because of this. And that would be wonderful. But that's in criminal law. It's civil law. And civil law goes under different doctrines. There isn't fruit of the poisonous tree in civil law, unfortunately. So nothing can be done about this evidence directly. This evidence won't be tossed. It won't be considered ill-gotten or illegally retrieved. Nothing like that is going to happen. However, and this really depends on the particular judge. Some judges will be more offended by this than others. We don't know what sort of take Judge Lyman will have on this. But it does look like Brian Friedman is going to make some demands here, which he has every right to do on behalf of his client. This, to me, is unquestionably abusive process. Will Judge Lyman find that to be so? That's the big question. And if he does, he has the power to say, this law firm is disqualified. Brian Friedman has the right to ask for that. So it just depends on how strict this judge is. He could do that. And what would this case look like? They would have to hire a whole new team that would be given time to start all over again. It would delay this thing so much. So the judge may look at that as like, I don't want to delay this. But I sincerely hope he disqualifies these people because this is really dirty. And it came out of their law firm. This was Samantha Katz from Manat, Phelps & Phillips. Now, this doesn't affect Michael Gottlieb. He's from a different firm. And then we have 3 attorneys that are working under Manat, but they're working pro hoc vice. So I'm not sure how all of that will play into it. But this will be a devastating loss for Blake and Ryan if they do lose this law firm. And it really just shows that they operate under bad faith. We've already gotten that vibe. And another thing I want to say, I was looking back through my old videos, and it was kind of exciting because we started this conversation. Back on March 8th, I started a series of 3 different episodes that were specifically about this subpoena. We were the first to be talking about this. And now here we are, 6 weeks later, and it's like the big topic of the whole lawsuit. So it was kind of exciting to see, starting from my instincts, as soon as something was filed that I felt were wrong, this little conversation on my little channel, and now it's something the whole world's talking about 6 weeks later, and that's pretty exciting. I feel like we started the conversations on the subpoena and choice of law, which turned into really big conversations. The one topic that I wish got bigger was about in the New York Times, the absolute privilege that they're claiming, and choice of law. Those are things that we're still waiting for, and we talked about that before we talked about the subpoenas. So, that's why I like to sit and think and come up with stuff like that no one else has been talking about. But beyond this information at this point, from here on out, we can only just really speculate. This is about enough as far as facts that we're going to know until some decisions are made. Unless we finally see a copy of that subpoena, there really wasn't much to dig out about this lawsuit. But to try to give you a concise summary, here are the main points. It looks like an abusive process. Brian Friedman called it that as well, but it won't be abusive process until the judge calls it abusive process. So let's hope he does that. Why is it an abusive process? Because even though Doe lawsuits are allowed, we have to distinguish between a true Doe lawsuit and a sham lawsuit. Because a Doe lawsuit is filed with the purpose of you're not quite sure who exactly will be the defendant or all of the defendants until you get further information. And sometimes that's the case. It's not weird for them to be closed, but they're closed because something happens that you can't proceed with a lawsuit, or you decide you'd rather not proceed with the lawsuit. If in fact you find what you're looking for, your complaint gets amended, and instead of Doe, the names get replaced. So the fact this wasn't filed in her name, but in this obscure company that had nothing to do with Wayfair, shows that this is not a typical Doe lawsuit, but it's a sham lawsuit put up for one purpose, the purpose of collecting information. The other problem, it was filed at the end of September, but Leslie Sloan had made threats about having seen these things in August. More proof that this is a sham lawsuit and not a regular Doe lawsuit is that as they got this information, none of this information was ever added to this lawsuit because they had no intention of pursuing it on this lawsuit. As they got access to all this information, which they obviously did, as I said, this lawsuit ended on December 19th, the day before the CRD, which was the day before the New York Times article was put out. These people weren't Does anymore, and yet they were never added to this lawsuit, proving they never intended to go through with this lawsuit. Sham. And then, of course, that other problem is that they had this information in August. How did they have it? It looks like this was a sham lawsuit to cover their tracks for having it, to pretend they got it legally, and they probably thought nobody was ever going to find it, which is probably why they haven't shown the subpoena, because they knew the minute that they did, this lawsuit was going to be uncovered. Oh, and the last point I want to add to the summary is that this is not fruit from a poisonous tree that only exists in criminal law, not in civil law. This evidence will not be thrown out, but the lawyers might be. It all comes down to Judge Lyman and how strict of a judge he is. If he's more concerned with time than he is with things like this, he'll probably let it go, which will infuriate the world. But brace yourself because it could happen. But if he feels played by this, if he's more a procedural guy, this is going to make him mad. He's not a fast decision maker. Today's the 18th. Today was the deadline to add defendants, and today was the deadline to amend complaints. Will this change it because of this new information and they need time to investigate this? It very well could. And Justin has every right to ask for it because this is very new information for them and they need time to look into it. So this really could change the timeline of these deadlines in the scheduling order. So Judge Lyman's going to have to address this. And he's going to have to address it soon. And for heaven's sake, please rule on the motions to dismiss already. I find it crazy that we don't have even just one of them decided now. Because, you don't sit around and decide them as a whole. You decide them one by one. So I really hope we hear from that soon. And I hope there's a hearing that we all get to listen to again to discuss this, because this is crazy. And like I said, from the first week of March, I knew there was something wrong with this subpoena. Did 3 episodes on it, 3 back-to-back episodes talking about this subpoena because it didn't make sense to me. And I'm so glad that it got investigated and that this was discovered. And I want to say it looks like this was discovered by someone named Katie Joy. So I wanted to make sure and say that. But also, and I've never thought I'd say these words, I wanted to shout out some subreddits. I used to have a Reddit account back in like 2018, but things kind of got really nuts in the particular subs that I was in at that time, and I deleted and never looked back. But last night, I needed more information. I was directed there. Now, when I first started looking, I found some crazy sites because, I looked under Justin, first of all, and there are some whacked out sites of people who are just, wow, madly in love with Blake Lively and putting out some horrible, weird stuff. I'm like, okay, this is why I didn't want to go back to Reddit. Then I found a couple really nice ones. There's one called Team Justin Baldoni, I believe. And they do a good job at keeping out the arguing and the fighting, which is the thing I hate about Reddit. It seems like there's people that just want to go there and just fight all day. Like they don't, and I don't understand that mindset to just go somewhere that you disagree with people and just stay there all day and fight. So, I won't shout out the other one because even though it had some good stuff and some Justin supporters, they allow people to come in and just like squat all day and fight. And I don't like that. But Team Justin Baldoni was really good. And there was another one. What was it? It was more funny. It was, Blake Lively Snark, I believe. But shout out to Team Justin Baldoni. I will probably be back there visiting. I don't know that I'll actually make a new account and ever be actually on there again, but they did have some good information. I was able to see a TikTok attorney that I really liked, not actually Golden. I don't have TikTok, so I looked for her on other platforms and wasn't able to find her. But for those of you who have TikTok, she's really good. Really good. She's very reasonable. I love that she sits and thinks things through and then comes and speaks. And you can see her brain working as she's speaking. She is my kind of person. So shout out to Not Actually Golden. And of course, I love the Ask Two Lawyers. And I really love some of the guests they've had on recently. They're on YouTube. I think I've posted them. I posted links to their account before because I can't do this full time. I have so many other obligations I have to do. So I don't get to be here consistently like I wish that I could. And I know that's probably frustrating as you guys sit and wait for me to finally have time to do something. So I do like to give you other options to watch when I can't be with you. But they had Judge Liz on last night, and she was really interesting, and she has a channel as well. I haven't gone and checked that out yet because it was the middle of the night, but I do intend to check that out. But I think it's just called Judge Liz. But before that, they had Ron Zambrano. But he is an actual California lawyer. This is his specific field of expertise. He's a smart guy. He thinks things through, well-spoken. I wish he had a channel because I would listen to him every day. So if you see him guest appearing anywhere else, highly recommend watching him. I specifically loved his take on 47.1 because that's the one thing I don't agree with the Ask Two Lawyers about. I think it scared them a little too much and that they think it's a little stronger than it actually is. It's just like anti-slap stuff. There are ways to overcome these because you can't just come with an accusation and say, well, I have this privilege, so you can't touch me. Because there are, and I did hear Judge Liz say this last night and I loved it. Not every woman who comes forward with a story is telling the truth. There are malicious storytellers out there. I pointed this out to you months ago about the woman who claimed that some guy had assaulted her and he went to jail. And he was just a guy she saw in the parking lot of a supermarket. And this guy was sitting in jail, accused, reputation ruined, because she didn't like the way he looked in a parking lot. This man hadn't said a word to her. And he was in jail. And it took some time for the police to start to realize that her story wasn't adding up. And all this while, this man's being labeled a rapist and he's sitting in jail. And he hadn't done anything. So you can't have a privilege out there that lets people just willy-nilly say what they want and be like, nah, I'm protected. I'm a woman. I have this privilege. There are ways to overcome this, and Malice is one of them. And you know what? All these shenanigans, which is exactly what this Sham lawsuit is, a shenanigan, these work perfectly toward proving malice. So in this case, all of these little manipulative ways that Blake went about this lawsuit, they don't look good for her. And I said this before. If you've actually been harassed in this manner, the S manner, and you want to tell the world that you're traumatized by it, and you never acted on it, but then you're this worried about what people are saying about you, that's what all of this reaction is to. None of this is about the harassment. all the lengths that she went to prove that he's the reason people said things about her on the internet. This is her concern. You know, and if that had happened, you would want that actually documented somehow. But it was an afterthought. In my opinion, it was put there as a means to go after him for this other thing, for making people say bad things about her on the internet, which I don't believe is why people said bad things about her on the internet. So yeah, I don't think 47.1 has power in this case because Brian Friedman has the kryptonite. There was Malice. All the superpowers of 47.1, Malice is the answer. So we have more evidence of the sneaky ways that Blake going about everything she did with this lawsuit. This isn't a lawsuit filed to say, I was injured. I was harassed. I'm struggling to cope with what happened to me. I need a remedy. I need a legal remedy. You know, that's not what she has presented to the world with the actions that she's taken. It was all calculated. It was, I'm not filing anything until I get all my ducks in a row. I heard about these text messages from another scorned woman, Stephanie Jones. Now I'm going to go about legitimizing them with this sham lawsuit. Then I'm going to deliver the information straight to the biggest newspaper in the world, the New York Times. We're going to keep this quiet for 3 months as we build this story based on this questionably retrieved information. And then the day before, we're going to file this little complaint, not open to the public. And she didn't leave it for them to even pursue, which I feel like tells a lot. If you're really upset about that, you're going to want them to investigate it, the proper people to properly investigate it. Because this lawsuit is not investigating that harassment the way the Civil Rights Department would have. Because this lawsuit's not even about that. This lawsuit's about some people talked bad about me on the internet, and I couldn't face that it actually was because of something I did. So I'm going to go after this guy because it's his fault. And now look, the entire world is talking bad about you on the internet. So congratulations. And again, this, her being in the 100 influential people, you know, I'm going to say this. Hitler was Man of the Year in Time magazine. I think it was 1938. It's not a judge of character to be listed here. But here's my question. They're describing her as being influential. And you know what? This woman who put her up for it, she deserves all of the hate that she's getting. Because we know this woman didn't just wake up and say, you know what? I've been laying here thinking about just how marvelous that Blake Lively is. 6 years ago, she gave us $2 million. What an influential person. What a brave person. What an inspiring person. That never happened. So what made this woman, all these years later, and that's the only thing she can attribute to Blake, is that Blake gave them money. And the money was given because people were harassing them about having their wedding on a plantation. And not just any old plantation, a plantation that still has slave houses in it that you can tour. And I promise you, they're not in any condition that actual slaves lived in when they actually lived in those places. They have been beautified to make it look like it wasn't so bad. To go down and ooh and ah over a plantation. That's the kind of influencer Blake is. She influenced people to think that that's okay, that that's something to strive for. I wonder how many people chose that venue because of her. That's the kind of influence she's left. And after being called out for it for a long time, they tried to make it right with the non-apology apology and some money. But here's the thing. There are true philanthropists, people like Keanu Reeves, Melinda Gates, Mackenzie Scott. These are people who give away huge chunks of wealth. We just passed an important day, tax day. When you have millions, your taxes are very, very high. If any of you contribute to charities, you know that those are tax deductions. If you're going to owe huge amounts of tax, you can lessen that blow by giving the money to a charity instead of the IRS. So a lot of this so-called philanthropy, when it's in small amounts compared to the amount of wealth a person has, it's money that's going to be taken from them, but instead of going to the IRS, they put it somewhere that looks good. And I'm not saying that that's bad, or we should say, oh, well, then that doesn't mean anything, because it's still a choice that they made. But what I'm saying is slapping down a little token amount of money that would have been taken from you by the IRS anyway, and you can use it to make an apology for some stupid thing you did before, and you don't keep doing it, you're not a philanthropist. You're an opportunist. What caused that woman to get up and say, oh, of all the people in the world who've done wonderful things, Blake Lively is a titan because 6 years ago she gave the NAACP some apology money? It doesn't make sense. And then you hear Ryan is actually going to be speaking at the event. And there you have all the puzzle pieces that you need to see the picture. So are they influential? Yeah, we can't deny that. When you can make moves to get your wife put on this list, yeah, that's influential. Does that mean you're a good person? No. And we all know the truth. It wasn't given to her because of anything that she did to deserve it. It's the same story on repeat of when she was young and she was made head of the choir, even though by her own admission she couldn't sing and she couldn't dance. This is the life she has. She was raised that way and she married someone who would make sure the rest of her life was like that. But influence? She moved next door to Martha Stewart and then thought that she could become her, did a website, failed within a year. But anyway, keep your eye out for what's going on. And like I said, I have so many obligations that I can't always be here like I wish I could be here. So I always want to give you other options of who to watch when I can't be here. And like I said, that one subreddit, if you're not a Redditor and you don't know the kind of stuff that goes on there, I would kind of avoid the others. But Team Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively Snark, who look like they might be worth your time. But beware of the others because there are stalkers there, it looks like. But anyway, just when I thought the lawsuit was about to go quiet, when all of these filings were going to be finally done, this happens. I think there probably will be a hearing, and I think there will be some filings, because this has to be dealt with. But there it is. Blake and Ryan are sneaky, sneaky snakes. We knew that. Now we have proof of that. Their law firm, I heard it said somewhere yesterday, you hire the attorney that you're the most like. And so, yeah, well-suited law firm to Blake. But it all depends on Judge Lyman, what he decides to do. So till then, this is Cassidy O'Connell saying stay well and stay tuned.